Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back on this cold, chilly, but sunny day. It's nice to see sun once again. My solar panels have not been happy this month, but they're probably happier than I am, not producing electricity. Thank you so much for coming out. As I said, today we're going to talk about the history of modern China in part two. We did part one in October, which started about 4,000 years ago and came up through the Chinese Revolution, the Civil War and Chinese Revolution, with China being proclaimed a communist country in 1949. So today we're going to go from 1949 to the future. Just one comment before I begin. I was a high school teacher, and one of the courses I taught was Russian history. That was actually my specialty in history, was Russian history. I always taught it with great enthusiasm, and when my principal would come in and observe me, he kept on thinking I was a communist. Okay? And so I want to say I'm not a communist, but I enjoy the history. So if I talk about communist China with great enthusiasm, it's for the history, not necessarily the communist part. But it is a fascinating history of fascinating people. I want to introduce my wife, Jana Gardella, and don't worry, she baked. And I'll tie the theme in as we go along. So the essential question: will the 21st century be China's century? So I want you to think about this as we go through the history of modern China, and we're also going to have a discussion on current China at the end here. So we'll do a quick overview and then look at Chairman Mao and Premier Zhou Enlai, the General Secretary Deng Xiaoping, who made a huge change in China, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, and then end up with Xi Jinping and China as a global power. Then we'll have our discussion. So the map of China in green on the projection of the world projection, and it's a huge country. Yes, yeah. But just to place it for you, and I've dropped my cap here. Okay, next slide.
I don't see Hong Kong.
It was on there. Okay, so the People's Republic of China, an overview. The PRC, the People's Republic of China, is the largest country in East Asia with a population of 1.4 billion people. The United States has 330 million. So think about 1.4 billion people. And that actually explains a lot about China, just the size of it. It has 56 distinct ethnic groups, though Han Chinese comprise 91% of the population. 292 living languages, though Mandarin is spoken by 70% of the people. It's governed by the Communist Party of China, the CPC, which has jurisdiction over 22 provinces, think of them as states. There are 5 autonomous regions and 2 special administrative districts, Macau and Hong Kong. And we'll talk about those a little bit later, more specifically. There's one party socialist republic. So there's one political party. And the title of the General Secretary of the Communist Party is actually the most powerful position in China. And as we go through the history, sometimes the titles change somewhat. The premier becomes the president, et cetera, a few things. And they tend to hold, the General Secretary is also the president. But not always, so it can get a little confusing. China's GDP, gross domestic product, according to the World Bank, expanded from 150 billion in 1978 to 13.5 trillion in 2018, where the US GDP is 20 $1.5 trillion. So it's still larger. China is the largest exporter of goods, which we all know very well in our shopping, but it's also the second largest importer of goods in the world, which people probably don't realize or appreciate. It has the largest number of rich people in the world. Yeah, largest number. Yeah, there's a lot of rich people today in China. Not in 1978, but today. And it's a China's a nuclear power and it has the second largest military budget in the world, and it's a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, okay, which is actually the organ within the United Nations that actually has some power that can do some things, so that's important. Urban China has grown steadily, with 20% of the Chinese living in cities in 1980. It's now 55% are urban dwellers. Has 7 mega cities which have a population of more than 10 million people. 10 million people. I think Boston has a population, Boston proper, of around 700,000. Within 128 is 5 million. Just to give you an example of the size. They have 160 cities with more than 1 million people. Since 1986, compulsory education is required through 9 years of school, but 48% go on to post-secondary or trade schools, and the literacy rate is almost 97%. Health coverage is about 95% of the population, though it's now, surprisingly enough, privatized health care as opposed to socialized health care. Atheism is the official religion in the People's Republic of China. Religion is, freedom of religion is actually guaranteed in the Constitution, but it's freedom of approved religions. And we'll look at that a little bit later on as well. So some religious faiths are persecuted. Chairman Mao. Now, last time we talked about Chairman Mao, starting off in education. He's a teacher, a principal. I look over here. I've got 2 of my high school teachers in the room. Of course, Mr. Murray and Mr. Gauthier. And so I'm particularly nervous up here. One never gets over. You notice I said Mr. Murray and Mr. Gauthier, with great respect. Two wonderful teachers from Concord Carlisle High School. So Mao, of course, leads their communist China successfully during the Chinese Civil War, which lasted basically from the late 20s up until 1949. They basically created a cult of personality around Mao, where the official religion is atheism. Mao sort of becomes a god. Similar was done in Russia with Lenin and Stalin, at least for a period of time. You can see the size of Mao's statue, if you will, which was built by workers. But you see the crane to give you an idea behind him. You know how it's like a skyscraper, huge statue. Okay, so the PRC under Chairman Mao on October 1st, as I said, 1949, he proclaims victory over the Kuomintang, who were the nationalist group led by Chiang Kai-shek. The communists end up with control over mainland China. Well, the Kuomintang and Chiang Kai-shek flee to Taiwan, which is an island off of mainland China. And it remains independent, but we'll talk about that more as we go along as well. Mao immediately instituted many reforms aimed at uniting China. Remember, China had been in a civil war for a good part of the first half of the 20th century. And for the 19th century, if you remember, the Qing dynasty, it was really a mess in the 19th century with the Opium Wars and and huge rebellions and things. So China had been in dire straits for at least 150 years. So he was aimed at eliminating any remnants of old China, if you will. The Korean War. Okay, the Korean War starts, about 8 months after China actually becomes an independent country. And it's, of course, when North Korea attacked into South Korea in June 1950. And Kim Il-sung, who's the grandfather of the current leader of China, actually went to Stalin and Mao before he attacked South and basically asked them for permission to do this. And Stalin said, yeah, you can do it, but we're not going to help you. And Mao reluctantly said, okay, we won't stop you from doing it. We don't think it's a particularly good idea. So October 19th, after negotiations with both North Korea and the Soviets, and after the US General Douglas MacArthur, and I think we talked about this when we did the Cold War, right? And Truman had said, whatever you do, don't cross the Yalu River, and because you're going to bring China into the war. He ignored Truman. This is MacArthur, and of course ends up getting fired over that. So he was gone, but that does bring the Chinese into the war. At its peak, China had 1.45 million troops fighting in Korea. They suffered 986,000 casualties, 400,000 of which were deaths. Okay, why does he enter the war? It's just almost exactly a year, a little under a year from when the country's actually formed. Well, he explains that he had to prevent the Soviets from taking over Korea. Mao's biggest concern was not the United States, it was the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was very expansionist. And so he really feared that. Stalin had said, we will not enter, the Soviets won't enter into the Korean War. Mao did ask him actually for support from the Air Force, from the Soviet Air Force, which they do provide. Now, he was asked, what about your fear of nuclear weapons, of either the United States or Russia bombing you with nuclear weapons? And this is sort of a traditional Chinese view. They say that at times you're going to have really good times and be really powerful, and at times are going to be horrible. And you may even be conquered, as they were, for instance, part of it at least by the Japanese in the 30s and up until the end of World War II. But according to the Chinese philosophy, we'll survive. We have a superior culture and civilization that will always survive. And he said in 1950 we have over 500 million citizens. They can't kill them all. And if some of them survive, China survives. He also explained that it would help unify China, build morale, and strengthen the position of the Communist Party in China, as well. Okay, early reforms. 47 to 52. So 47 is actually before they win, but they were controlling part of China at this time. Were land reforms, and basically transferring land from the wealthy landowners to the peasants. Well, Mao says to the rural peasants, go take the land, and if you have to, kill them. Kill the wealthy landowners and just take the land, be ruthless about it. So the peasants do, and that really wins Mao a lot of support with the peasant population. And between 1 million and 4.5 million people died as a result of this taking of the land. In 50 to 53, there's a campaign to suppress counter-revolutionaries. This is one of many campaigns to suppress counter-revolutionaries. And it's aimed at eliminating any opposition to the Communist Party, especially former Kuomintang supporters, businessmen and intellectuals. And between 700,000 and 2 million people die in this campaign. 1950 to 55, it's actually a social movement. They enacted new marriage laws, outlawing polygamy, arranged marriages, establishing the minimum age to marry at 21 for males and 18 for females. So that was something that was quite a positive move. Mao's revolutionary philosophy. Now this is actually key to understanding Mao and Communist China. He believed in continual revolution and political chaos. So he keeps on doing these things to really just jumble up the country, cause all sorts of problems, and his leadership team, if you will, the other leaders, sub-leaders to Mao, were always, I was going to say, pulling their hair out. It's hard for me to show that, but and it's to basically, he wants to attain pure communism. And the more I read about this, I kind of understood a little bit where he was coming from. If you think about 4,000 years, most of which was in imperial China, and then this long civil war, there was lots of opposition to things, and he's trying to unify the country. I mean, he goes to pretty extremes to do it. So one of the first campaigns, as a good example, are called the 3 Anti-campaign and the 5 Anti-campaigns of 51 and 52. The 3 Anti was targeted at Communist Party officials and government bureaucrats, ostensibly was aimed at eliminating corruption, waste, and bureaucracy. It also, of course, helped solidify him as the head of the Communist Party. The 5 Anti-campaign was against capitalist bourgeois class, sort of the middle class, the people who had owned the businesses and a lot of landowners and things like that, with the aim of eliminating bribery, theft of state property, tax evasion, cheating on government contracts, and stealing state economic intelligence. Stealing economic intelligence, yeah. And a third CCHS faculty member, I apologize, Mr. Roberts, I'm sitting right behind Mr. Goth here. You two know each other? So anyway, so a lot of people are going to be upset, and it's going to, cause a lot of problems with this, especially within the party. An estimated 20,000 cadres who are sort of workers within the Communist Party, and a further trained workers. The Communist Party trained 6,000 people to begin spying on the business affairs of their fellow citizens, basically. 15,000 trained propagandists worked to encourage parades, spontaneous anti-corruption parades throughout China. And then a letter writing campaign was supported, or they asked for workers to write letters turning in their bosses or their managers for corruption. And 210,000 letters were received just in the first month of this campaign. Activists pressured business leaders into confessing. One fellow who managed a company said, "Well, I've stolen $1 million from our company." A few weeks later, after more pressure, he goes, "I stole $1 billion from the company," which was ridiculous. You're talking 1950s company. Another company was averaging 10 letters a week, turning itself in. Okay, for corruption. Everybody was trying not to be caught, and not confessing. So it was a huge, huge disruption. All the leaders were put on trial, all were found guilty, and several hundred supposedly committed suicide. And you don't know if they were really purged or actually, I'm sure some did commit suicide. Mixed messages. The Sefon movement of 1955 under Mao's direction, the People's Daily, which was the official newspaper, announced that 10% of the Communist Party members were traitors. This is in 1955. Now, what's going on in the United States just before this? MacArthur, who is claiming, not MacArthur, McCarthy, yeah, McCarthy, as soon as I said it. And thank you, just keep me online. And that's what I love about this crowd. If I say something wrong, people are on it, which is wonderful. McCarthy was, of course, trying to root out communists in the State Department and in the US government and, of course, in private business and universities. So here's Mao trying to root out capitalists from the Chinese government, so it's kind of interesting. Yes, Judy?
I still remember watching on TV the Army McCarthy hearings and Joseph Welch saying, have you no sense of decency?
Yeah.
All less, have you no sense of decency?
Yeah.
And that brought him down.
Yeah, when he went after the army,
He went
McCarthy
into the
was
army.
done.
He had that corporal or something.
Yep.
Wow.
Yeah.
I still remember that.
So estimates of between 81,000 and 770,000 people were casualties of this campaign. So then he tries the 100, and so we're looking at the back and forth, right? The back and forth causing chaos. So he says, well, actually, we should be open to criticism. So the 100 Flowers campaign of 56 and 57 said, write in, tell us what we're doing wrong. It went pretty well until they criticized Mao. Okay, so then we end up with the anti-rightist campaign. Okay, so he comes back at them and accuses them of being rightists and saw persecution of an estimated 400,000 to 700,000 people. Remember, China is huge. There's a lot of people to get in trouble here. Intellectuals were the particular target of the campaign, and an estimated 10% of intellectuals, engineers, technicians were labeled as rightists during the campaign. Rightists meaning, anti-communist, the other end of the political spectrum from communism. And of course, if you were labeled that, you were subject to social exclusion, criticism, repentance, sessions, or going off to prison camp. The Great Leap Forward. How many of you remember the Great Leap Forward? Okay, so a few people in the room did. It was, again, Mao's biggest challenge he saw as the biggest threat was the Soviet Union. And we did a talk in here on the Soviet Union, Russian history and Soviet Union. If you remember in the 1930s, Stalin's 5-year plans. China basically comes up with their own 5-year plans, and it's basically trying to go from an agricultural society to a more modern industrial society. So he's going to force this to happen. But of course, it goes completely against what's supposed to happen. He collectivizes the land, the peasants, so puts them on collectivized farms, and that worked about as well as it did in the Soviet Union, which wasn't well at all. Industrialization, coercion and violence was used to enforce the policy. Private farming was prohibited, and those engaged in it were labeled as counter-revolutionaries and punished. But the results were the exact opposite. Because what the farmers did, the areas that just had farming and didn't have any industry, they were told you have to come up with so many tons of iron each year. So where are they going to find iron? Their farming implements, which they melted down. They had these field foundries, and they'd melt down their farming. So what do you use for farming? You don't have tools. And between 36 and 45, million people starved in China as a result of this. Not unlike what happened in the Soviet Union in the 1930s. Okay, part of this, 58 to 62, were the Four Pests campaign, which was a movement to rid China of rats, flies, mosquitoes, sparrows. And my wife said, what about the turkeys? It upset the ecological balance, leading to a proliferation of locusts, which destroyed crops right in the middle of the Great Famine. 63 to 66 was the socialist education movement, and government officials were sent out and intellectuals were sent out into the countryside to learn from the peasants. The goal was to eradicate reactionary elements in political, economic, agriculture, intellectual fields. Now, reactionary, okay, is beyond right of conservatives. Okay, so if you have a conservative, they want the status quo, they want to keep things the way they are. A reactionary goes, that's not good enough. We want to go back to the old ways, okay? And so he's saying, these people are trying to push us back to the old ways. We're going to send them out. They'll learn from the peasants. 1963, a young 22-year-old soldier by the name of Comrade Li Fang died, and he had kept a diary. And the diary is found, and it turns out to be a perfect propaganda tool because he talks about, the wonderful ideals of communism, including strong work ethics, self-sacrificing nature, unquestioning dedication to Mao Zedong and the socialist cause. So this becomes a big sort of political movement, hold them up as an ideal. The Cultural Revolution. Okay. So the Cultural Revolution lasted for about 10 years. And it's going to be a disaster. After the Great Leap Forward, which of course was a great leap backwards, Mao was kind of in a little bit of political trouble here. So he wants to strengthen his political power. He wants to strengthen communism by removing capitalist, traditional, and cultural elements from Chinese society to impose Maoist orthodoxy within the party. So Maoism is sort of like Marxism, but it's socialism with Chinese characteristics. Okay, that's the way it's going to be described. We'll get into more of what that means a little bit later. So the movement paralyzed China politically, significantly impacted the country economically and socially. We'll see how. Okay, so I'd mentioned at the opening the cult of personality. And if you look down in the right hand, the two posters in the lower right hand corner, you see this cult of personality where Mao is being held up to almost as a god. Okay, to the lower left are students, and they're going to become members of the Red Guard. Okay, now they all refer back to the Little Red Book. Okay, the Little Red Book. Think of it as sort of the communist Bible, if you will. They're Mao's quotes. And everyone was expected to have a copy of the Little Red Book and memorize the Little Red Book. And the students would come up to people on the streets, or they might go into their professors or their teachers and demand to hear a quote from the Little Red Book, and you better be able to do it. And if you couldn't, on the upper left is a fellow that's on a trial, and he's sort of wearing a dunce cap with basically things saying, what he'd done wrong. Okay. So this is going to last for 10 years. Go ahead. So destruction of the four olds were part of the Cultural Revolution movement. And the four olds Mao described as old customs, old culture, old habits, and old ideas. The Red Guards, as I said, were a mass student paramilitary movement. And they were mobilized to carry out destruction of the Four Olds, including cultural artifacts. Cultural artifacts. So now if you go on Antique, or if you watch Antiques Roadshow, and they have something from the Ming Dynasty or the Tang Dynasty, and it's like a gazillion dollars, the wealthy Chinese people today in China want some of their heritage, and they buy this stuff up and really drive the prices up, right? Paintings, literature, religious symbols, temples destroyed. People in possession of the items were punished with intellectuals and teachers specifically targeted. And between 500,000 and 2 million people died during the Cultural Revolution. Quite often you were sent out into the countryside. And this is going to involve a lot of people. Down to the countryside. This is not the song by Country Joe McDonald from Woodstock. But anyway, 68 to 78, sort of during the same time period, in an effort to curb the chaos caused by the Red Guard, Mao initiated the Down to the Countryside movement. So the students are just going crazy, you know, beating people up and causing all this problem. So he said, well, maybe the students should go out to the countryside and become re-educated. So they do. There's about a whole generation of students who don't go to college, who don't go to the essentially high school, and so that's a whole generation of people who lost their higher education. Détente. I think we all remember détente, or the hopes of détente, right? 72, President Richard Nixon traveled to Beijing and met with Chairman Mao and Premier Zhou Enlai. Now, he just didn't come up with this idea and call up, you know, Chairman Mao and say, can I come over for a visit? Henry Kissinger, who was the National Security Advisor and then Secretary of State for Nixon, and then Ford, Secretary of State for Ford, had actually been going to China for many years and meeting secretly with the Chinese. The United States government knew he was there, but the American people didn't know he was there. And they had basically come up with a secret verbal agreement that the Soviet Union was their mutual enemy. So, of course, in the West, Western Europe and the United States had developed NATO, remember NATO, to keep the Soviets out of Western Europe. And the Chinese were actually afraid of, as I mentioned earlier, of the Soviets coming into northern China. And so they agreed, we're going to block this. The Soviets actually kept more troops on the Chinese border than they did on the Western border. It was acknowledged by both sides due to domestic politics. They had to keep on talking, basically, in today's kids' terms, trash about each other. They couldn't say nice things about each other publicly, or let it be known that they were actually meeting and having these agreements, because it wouldn't be acceptable, okay? But finally, it comes around and they decide they can meet, okay? Now, two things are gonna come out of this. One is the United States did not block the People's Republic of China and replacing the Republic of China as the official China in the United Nations on the Security Council. So the United States doesn't block it. Okay, they allow China, People's Republic to come in. Remember, the Republic of China, Chiang Kai-shek's republic, was just on the island, and it was a much smaller entity. So that was one thing. The second thing that came out is the Shanghai Communique, where the US and China agreed to disagree over the issue of Taiwan. And that was their secret policy. Again, it wasn't written out, but they said, we're going to disagree. But the United States said, we'll pull troops out of Taiwan. Okay? We'd had troops in Taiwan since 1950. China had occasionally sent gunboats over, lobbed some bombs into Taiwan, or actually into a couple of islands off of Taiwan, but not really been very aggressive with it. And the United States hadn't fought back. So the United States says, okay, we'll withdraw if you will accept the one China, two system policy. And that's the way the Chinese look at Taiwan and have looked basically at Hong Kong as well, is that you're part of, we're not going to say that you're not part of China, you are part of China, but we're going to allow two systems of government. We have our, sort of communist, totalitarian, socialist political economic system, and of course Taiwan, Hong Kong were capitalists and more democratic. Of course, we see all the problems with Hong Kong today. It also led the way for normalization of relations and actually official diplomatic relations in 1979 under President Jimmy Carter. So this is set way back by Kissinger. So the US-China détente and ping-pong players. Okay, if you remember the ping-pong diplomacy, and it's shown very well in Forrest Gump, right? The movie Forrest Gump was actually, they began by having cultural exchanges, and ping pong is one of those. In the lower right-hand corner is Henry Kissinger and Zhou Enlai, who actually became pretty good friends. And of course, the lower left-hand corner were Mao and President Nixon. Mao was actually very, very old during this and not very well. So he really just sort of made some appearances, but didn't really do any negotiating or anything like that. Criticized Lin, criticized Confucius. So in 1973, Mao and what would become the Gang of Four, and we're going to talk more about them in a minute, criticized Lianbao and Confucianism. Lianbao was a hero of the Chinese Civil War and the Communist Revolution. He had been a famous general. Mao had led one contingent on the Long March, and Lianbao had led another contingent on the Long March as they were being chased through the mountains by Chiang Kai-shek. He had risen to vice chairman of the Communist Party in '58, and Mao in '66 had actually announced that Lianbao was going to be his successor. In '71, though, Lianbao is killed with his family when his airplane ran into a mountain as they're trying to escape Communist China. And supposedly he had attempted a coup d'etat, a takeover against Mao. The campaign was part of a revisionist history to replace traditional teachings of Confucius with those of Maoist ideology. Now, Confucianism is really, really deeply ingrained in the Chinese culture. So the campaign was also aimed at the premier of China, Zhou Enlai, and Deng Xiaoping, who was like the number 3 guy in China. And they were gaining power as Mao was getting older. Mao is starting to do less and less, being less active. I read a book called The New Emperors that was actually about 30 years ago, but talking how Mao lived in the imperial city, and he was living as an emperor, and he really was like a king. So Zhou became ill and went into a hospital, while Deng was purged, actually for the second time in the Cultural Revolution. He had been sent, this is the number 3 man in the government, had been sent to work on a pig farm. And the Red Guard had actually come to his house. He had a teenage son who they threw out of a 2nd-story window, broke his back, and he became paralyzed. So, I mean, again, that political chaos, continual revolution. Now, let's start on the right, because that's the colorized picture that really stands out, is Jiang Qing on the cover of a magazine. She was a film star. She's also Mao's third wife and final wife. And on the upper left is a photo of Mao and Jiang in 1938. And then in the lower left is Jiang during the Cultural Revolution. And she is the leader of the Gang of Four. The Gang of Four. So as I said, as he gets older, his policies continue to create political and social chaos. A power struggle emerges between Jiang and the leaders of the Gang of Four, and Zhou and Deng, who favored stability. The Gang of Four was, I already said that, former actress and his last wife. She had won a seat on the Politburo, and we're going to get into the government structure in a little bit, but Politburo was a very, it's like the cabinet. Think of it as the cabinet in China. In 1969, and gained power, and she controlled both state media and propaganda. And in China, that's a big thing. If you can control those, that gives you a lot of power. After Mao's death in September 1976, Jiang is arrested along with the other members of the Gang of Four, sentenced to death. Her sentence was eventually reprieved in '86 after she had developed a serious illness in prison. I think she died in '92.
Can I ask?
Yes.
Did lots of people try to flee China when all these people are being murdered? Could you get out at all?
Yeah, I think some. It wasn't as hard to get out of as, say, like with the Berlin Wall and that sort of thing.
Or Cuba.
Or Cuba, yeah, not that hard. Yeah, I think you could. A lot of Chinese that we saw, we'd hear of people from China living here were actually from Taiwan. A lot of them are from nationalist China because it was a very crowded place. And of course, now a lot of mainland people from China live in the United States. Do you want to speak to that?
Somebody, she was from Taiwan.
Oh, that's right. You were from Taiwan.
No, this is somebody I knew.
Oh, somebody you.
No, I'm from China.
She's from China too.
You're from mainland China.
No,
Okay.
this was just somebody I knew from school.
Okay.
And she said they finally got rid of, the damn Japanese.
Yeah.
And also the Chiang Kai-shek comes over and takes over the damn place.
Yeah.
And she was going to school there, Pratt, but she wasn't going back.
Yeah.
She was just going to stay here.
Yeah. But as I remember, you left China before Mao came to power, or
I left in '46.
in '46?
I got out.
Okay, so just after the war, during the Communist Revolution. Do you know if people were able to leave in the '50s and early '60s easily from China or not?
Probably not.
Okay.
I don't really recall.
Yeah, and I wish I had a better answer for you, Mrs. Taylor. I'm not sure.
I had no idea. I just didn't know. It sounded just awful.
Yeah. A lot of the people, though, are like any country, are working as hard as they can to survive, and they're less political than you might think. Okay, we'll go on to the next slide. Okay, his legacy, Mao's legacy. Supporters of Mao claim that he transformed China from a country divided by civil war to a united socialist and sovereign nation. And you do have to give him that. He did unite the country under socialism, which was his vision, and it was sovereign. He kept it independent. He's credited with developing infrastructure, industry, healthcare, and education, and improving the standard of living in China. Now, literacy rate in 1949 was 20%, and it grew to 65% by 1969. But it was still very much a third world nation, okay, in 1976 when he passes. Now, his supporters also claim that Mao's programs, which caused so much chaos and death, were necessary to purify Chinese society so a new democracy could be formed in China. Okay, a new democracy. So let's take a look at what he meant by a new democracy. He believed that China needed a new form of democracy different than the representative style democracy that we have in the United States and in Western Europe. He said that's not going to work for China. He stated that each third world nation needed to develop their own form of democracy based on their unique history and needs. Okay? We're going to get into this more when we get towards our discussion at the end. He claimed that parliamentary democracies were just instruments to promote dictatorship by the bourgeoisie and landowning classes over the masses. So he said your typical representative who gets elected, the rich people, and what do? They pass laws to make sure they're still rich, okay, and get control. Under this new democracy, economy would be protected by four revolutionary classes, who were the peasants, the proletariat, which are the workers, that's a socialist word for workers, the intelligentsia, which are the educated people, professors and whatnot, and the petite bourgeoisie, which he explained as a semi-autonomous peasantry and small-scale merchants or businessmen. Okay, so he said you're going to have semi-autonomous farmers and small-scale businessmen, along with the other classes, are going to protect our economy. Okay, Deng Xiaoping and economic reforms. We will be taking a break, so don't worry. I just want to get through quite a bit here. Hua Guofan, I'm probably murdering that name, but became both the premier of China and the chairman of the Communist Party after Mao's death. His major accomplishment was the removal of the Gang of Four and throwing them in jail. But Deng is going to it doesn't overthrow him, he forces them out, politically forces them out, Hua out into retirement, because Hua refused to do major reforms. He wanted to basically just keep the country going as Mao had set it up. Deng, who had become a communist while working in France in the 1920s, was an early supporter of Mao, was instrumental in the success of the Long March and the Communist Revolution. After returning from power from being purged twice, as we'd mentioned in the Cultural Revolution, he becomes a pragmatic leader, a practical leader. Okay, someone who rules based on the reality and not just on idealism. When we did the growing nationalism in Europe, and we talked about Bismarck. Bismarck is the perfect example in Germany of a pragmatic leader. Okay. Once in power, Deng stated that the Cultural Revolution had been a huge disaster for China, but he said you can't really fully blame Mao. He said he's a human, all humans make mistakes, and if you do balance, he did more good than he did bad, so Mao was a great man. But he's going to change everything. So Deng meets with President Ford and Mrs. Ford. This would have been about in 1975. Deng is 5 feet tall. Very, very, petite man. And a quiet guy. He's not a guy that's going to give up and give fiery speeches, but he's kind of James Madison. Okay, James Madison was an intellectual. He's a little guy. But he spoke pretty softly. Wasn't very well, but people listened to him because when he said something, it meant something. And of course, on the right is Deng, and you see, sort of faded out a little bit, is Jimmy Carter. His social and political reforms. 77 and 79, he launches the Beijing Spring, which allowed for a public criticism of the Cultural Revolution. Of course, he criticized it himself. In 77 to 79, he reinstates college entrance exams, which of course had been in place in China for like 1,000 years, right? Which had been suspended during the Cultural Revolution. In 86, he requires 9 years of compulsory education. Sets term limits for officials in China. In the 1980s, he's the one that actually puts in family planning policy, the one-child policy, which was actually probably really required, but it was also kind of brutally carried out. Now, it wasn't actually for the entire country, it was for urban areas, basically for the cities, but forced abortions were not unheard of. In 83, the Strike Hard anti-crime movement saw an estimated 24,000 executions in the first year. 24,000. The Communist China is tough on criminals. Drug addicts, it's illegal. It's a death penalty for being a drug addict. And they'll take the drug addicts, put them into a rehabilitation hospital, get them cleaned up, get their organs cleaned up and everything, execute them, Chinese style, one bullet in the back of the head, harvest the organs. Okay, and then use the organs either to sell or to, within their own country. But that's, yes, Judy?
With that one-child policy, and of course they wanted boys. So the girls were just left out to die, and then later on there's a shortage of them. Yeah,
that was, So there's a lot of unintended consequences here, this horrible things. He did negotiate with Britain and Portugal for the future return of Hong Kong and Macau. Hong Kong's 97, Macau 99. In the agreements, he promised that Hong Kong and Macau could continue their economic system and they'd be guaranteed their civil liberties for 50 years. And he said after 50 years, and of course this is what, early 1980s, so we're coming up on the 50 years. But again, it's based on the one country, two systems principle. He backs the third constitution in 1978, which included the 4 modernizations policy with an emphasis on social democracy, scientific and educational development to make China a strong nation. His socialist open market reforms sort of sound like an oxymoron, right? Socialist but open market. To improve the Chinese economy, he wanted to integrate, or he does integrate China into the global market. The 4 modernizations program goals were to improve agriculture, industry, science, technology, and the military. Science and technology being one. 86, he announces, and this is a Chinese way, a 70-year plan. Can you imagine an American president coming out and saying, okay, this is my 70-year plan? Okay. Our plans tend to go by quarters, right? For the stock market. But anyways, step 1 was to double the gross national product and ensure that all Chinese people had enough food, clothing, and shelter. Step 2 was to quadruple the GNP by the end of the 20th century, and they actually did it. The GNP of 1980, they actually did it by 1995. And step 3 was to increase the GNP to the level of medium developed countries by the year 2050, at which point Chinese people would live a nice lifestyle, and basically the modernization campaign would be over because they'd be a modern country. Okay? Now, before Deng, China had an economy was similar to the Soviet Union's in that it was centrally planned economy under the control of Beijing which set production quotas and prices. So it said to the manufacturing establishments and farms or whatever, this is what you're going to grow, this is how much you're going to grow, and this is what it's going to sell for. sort of regardless of the realities of the market. Well, he's going to change that. He early changes or reforms a decollectivization of agriculture, opening, and this is huge, to foreign investment. He set up special economic zones so foreign companies could come in and operate in China, and permission for entrepreneurs to start businesses. So these are private businesses, which is called capitalism. Capitalism, right? So this is huge. Later reforms focused on fewer government controls of these private enterprises, including small-scale privatization of state enterprises. So decentralization of state control also allowed state or provincial and local governments to experiment with different ways of having a successful economy for their own village, their own city, their own province, which actually proved successful, but it did challenge the state-owned enterprises. In 1986, the 863 program, which allowed, which was a high-tech development program inspired by President Reagan's SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative. And China's supercomputers and advanced spacecraft actually came out of this program. So it was like, real emphasis. And this is one thing I will see with China, is China puts a lot of money into R&D, research and development, and supporting new industries. For instance, the solar panels on our roofs, right? A lot of them come from China, or Chinese companies. Where were we? 863. 1992, he reopens the Shanghai stock market, which had been closed by Mao 40 years earlier. And Mao said, and I love this, socialism doesn't mean that we have to live in poverty together. Okay. He got it. This is 29. So my wife tells me it's time for a break. Now she bakes some, since it's it's Christmas season, but we're talking about China. So she made ginger crinkles, but she put red sugar topping on it for for communist China, and wore her red top. She said, "Do you think this would be appropriate for communist China?" So I said, "Absolutely." So please enjoy a cookie. We have a pretty good crowd. So Charles, one to start with. Help yourselves, people. Go for a cookie. About a 7 or 8 minute break. Okay, so let's get back to Deng Xiaoping. Are we rolling? Or okay, get back to Deng Xiaoping on the open market reforms. Oh, okay, we finished that slide. Yeah, thank you. I thought we had. Opposition to the reforms. So a gentleman during the break came up. So Deng was actually a revolutionary because he's moving away from pure social, and that's exactly correct. He's a pragmatic leader. He really cares for China. So what do we have to do? Well, there are people, of course, that were against his economic reforms, and he put an emphasis on materialism, on building things, infrastructure, and getting the Chinese people some goods so they have a better lifestyle, etc., as opposed to just ideological, socialism, etc. So many older conservatives, and being conservatives, I'm not talking about right of the political spectrum, I'm talking people who are on the left, but they wanted to keep it the way Mao had, like during the revolution. Blocked some of his reforms and protected special interest groups. Now, the young people in China are very upset with this. They see corrupt officials, they see nepotism, and it caused unrest. So part of the reason is that not everybody was enjoying economic benefits equally, and that's true of China today. We'll get into that more later. But in the 1980s, it had a mixed economy. So some goods were still fixed prices by the government, which tended to be really, really inexpensive. where other goods, and kind of the goods people wanted, were on the market, would fluctuate with market prices. Now, which meant that people with money could buy these special goods, okay? And the other people and a lot of the students could not, so they were upset. They also had grievances against the legitimacy of the one-party rule. There was inflation because going over to a market economy. Preparedness of recent graduates for the new market economy. So kids were getting out of college and saying, we're not prepared to work in this world of a free market, of an open market. Tiananmen Square, we all know this, and of course is the image of the young man standing in front of the tank, which I should have put on here and I didn't, I apologize. But in April 1989, Huo Yaobang became the general secretary. Had become the general secretary, but he had died, okay? And he was a pro-reform general secretary. So when he dies, the students basically go, oh, there goes the guy that's helping us do reforms, and they start to protest. They demanded government accountability, constitutional due process, guaranteed due process, freedom of speech and press. And in May, students went on a hunger strike. And that gained national attention, and the protests spread to more than 400 cities in China. At the height of this protest, there were more than 1 million protesters in Tiananmen Square. And they were staging a mass sit-in. On May 20th, fearing political unrest, Deng and the Communist Party elders called for martial law in the areas around Beijing. Beijing is this huge, huge city, huge. It's the capital, of course, but also just physically very large. So when the students refused to leave, Deng sent in 300,000 heavily armed troops. And on the morning of June 4th, the armed troops marched down the avenues and started shooting and killing the protesters. A lot of the students had been joined by workers, and they were shot at, and even bystanders who were just watching, a lot of them were shot. The official death toll set by the government was 300, but many other groups, and I tried to do a range just from looking at different. Okay, what happened there? We just lost our. Oh, it's back. Okay, I think maybe every once in a while just touch it. It just timed out. Between 2,700 and 3,400 people were killed, but it's going to have a big impact. Okay, aftermath of Tiananmen Square. After the massacre, many people were arrested. Many workers were actually executed. Students who tended to come from more affluent families actually, of course, received lighter sentences. Party members, and there were party members who had protested at Tiananmen Square as well, they were sent off to political camps for retraining. This is a big socialist communist thing to do, is to send people for retraining, basically re-indoctrination, if you will. June 4th incident marked the end of the relative freedom of the press in China. I don't know if you read the Globe today, but there was an article in the Globe saying that China had more journalists in jail in 2019 than any other country in the world, Turkey being number 2, Egypt being number 3. But anyways, new restrictions were placed on both domestic and foreign press, and the Communist Party reestablished control over the press, publishing, and the media. Western governments denounced China's action, while Asian nations offered little coverage. Most Asian nations offered little coverage of the events. So, political impact. the Communist Party regained a lot more control over domestic policies in China. Deng actually retired at this point. We're going to hear from him again, but he retires. And by 93, the General Secretary, the Central Military Commission Chairman, and the President were all consolidated into the same person, and that remains so today. After the massacre, police and internal security forces were actually, for the first time, equipped with non-lethal means of suppressing protests. That was one of the issues. They didn't have rubber bullets, they didn't have tear gas, things like that. So they were given those. So Deng comes back in 92. He retires in 89, but he's active behind the scenes. And some people, the Westerners really don't ever know who's in power sometimes in places like China. And some historians say, well, he actually never left power, he just left the position officially. But anyways, he comes back and goes on what's known as the Southern Tour, where he visits 4 provinces and basically starts speaking about his economic agenda. And at first he's ignored by the official press. Jiang Zemin, who was the new general secretary, finally has to recognize him because he's getting picked up by the local press, even though the official nationwide press is ignoring him. They recognize him, and people are getting excited about what he's saying. So Zemin starts to allow the press to cover it. Deng is credited with saying, "To get rich is glorious," which spurred a new movement of entrepreneurs in China and the growth of new economic zones near Shanghai. Deng said that some will gain wealth, but others, before others, but wealth will eventually flow from the coasts inland. It struck me, those of you who have studied the Constitutional Convention of 1787, is basically who's the guy from Dickinson from Pennsylvania said the same thing. He said the busy haunts of men, meaning the coasts along the coast, are wealthy, but eventually that wealth will work its way in. So it's just, here we are a couple hundred years later. Deng died in 1997 of Parkinson's disease, but his political and economic policies were smartly carried on by Zemin. Deng did not repudiate Leninism, Marxism philosophy, but sought to adapt it to current socio-economic conditions in China. Okay? We're getting a little feedback here. I appreciate the help. Can you still hear me okay? Yeah, I think that's a lot better. Okay. What's that? Yeah, okay. Oh yes, thank you. I forgot where I was. Deng is viewed as the great architect of Chinese socialist opening up, if you will, and the modernization of contemporary China. So he's the guy that really is going to make the difference. A revolutionary, as this gentleman has properly said. Okay, so here are the 3 general secretaries after Deng. Jiang Zemin served just from 89 to 2002 and retires. He's actually fairly elderly. Hu Jintao from 2002 to 2012, and then Xi Jinping, who is the current general secretary. And we're going to look at their policies for each one. Okay, Jiang Zemin came to power as a compromise candidate after Tiananmen Square. Some people want to really crack down and really be forceful and make it much more totalitarian. Others said, no, we have to continue the reforms. He's credited with the term socialist market economy. Under his leadership, China experienced substantial growth, economic growth, 8% per year in their GDP, and it was accepted into the World Trade Organization. Hong Kong and Macau, by prior agreement, as we'd seen, were peacefully returned to China, but maintain their own systems as those special zones we had talked about. During Jiang's period of rule, economic reforms led to high rates of unemployment, though. Social welfare programs were ill-equipped to help the people. State-owned enterprises were replaced by private industry and even foreign-owned companies. They were laying people off, becoming more efficient. They didn't need as many workers. Plus, a lot of the rural peasants are moving into the city, especially the young people, because they just can't get the things that they want out in rural areas. Jiang's 3 represents, which is basically his social economic theory for China. The first part of it was advanced productive forces, meaning economic production, so improving their production. Progressive course of China's advanced culture, meaning cultural development. And finally, the fundamental interests of the people, meaning political consensus. Now, one of the main goals of the theory was to change the Communist Party in China into a more democratic party. So they opened up party membership to many more Chinese people, as well as businessmen and managers. Remember, they had been purged out, a lot of them early on under Mao. And this theory said would create more allies of China and the state and reduce the number of people who were considered to be class enemies of the state. So more openness. And this allowed for the incorporation, no pun intended, of capitalists and business class into the party and moving away from a purely ideological party where their main, stated goal is to protect the peasants and working class. Now, democracy in China, and I apologize, this is a little small, but I'll go through it. Elections in China, okay, are hierarchical. So at the village and city, which would probably be sections within a city, level, in other words, the local level, there's actually direct elections. So the people elect members for what are known as the People's Congresses. Does anybody know what the People's Congresses at any level in Russia or in the Soviet Union were called? No. Soviets. Yeah, Soviets. Okay, so think of Soviets were councils, okay? And so these are councils, People's Congresses. So at the lowest level, they're directly elected. Going up, and there's several levels of People's Congresses, each one of the higher Congress is elected or chosen, the members are chosen by the lower level. Okay, sort of a waterfall, a reverse waterfall, I guess you would call it. All the way up to the National People's Congress, and those are indirect, so they're indirectly elected. So you elect as a Communist Party member the local level, and then the committee, if you will, chooses the people they're going to serve higher at each level going up. Did I do okay explaining that? People understand that? Okay. Again, interesting, if you go back to 1787 and the Constitutional Convention, that's exactly what James Madison had actually initially suggested, that we as citizens would just vote for our state representatives, who would choose the congressman would choose the senators would choose the president, and the president would choose the Supreme Court. Okay? Because they wanted to keep the people as far away from actual choosing as possible, right? From the mob. All right. So now the NPC is the National People's Congress, elects 200 members of what's called the Central Committee, which chooses 24 members of the Politburo, which chooses 7 members of the Politburo Standing Committee, which determines policy. Now, the General Secretary is also selected out of the Central Committee. So basically 200 people vote for the General Secretary. And of course, he's the top party and the top governmental leader. It's a one-party state, I'd mentioned that earlier, but it does have 8 subordinate parties. These are actually permitted or accepted parties and allowed to exist, and independent candidates are allowed to run for local, village, and city level, but not anything higher. The CPC is organized on Lenin's principle of democratic centralism. So democratic centralism says that it's open to debate. We're going to figure out a policy for our nation. The people, we can discuss it. The lower, political leaders, we can discuss it. But once a decision is made, everybody will follow that decision, okay? That's democratic centralism, okay? And you better follow it or you'll be in trouble. There are no specific requirements for membership in the Communist Party, but you have to apply. Now, in 2014, 22 million people applied and 2 million were accepted. Now, if you think about it, it's not quite as hard as it is to get into Harvard, but it's still pretty hard, right? But 2 million out of 22 million. In the past, membership was based on one's ideology. Now emphasis on one's educational and technical qualifications.
Wow.
That's a big difference. There are 90.5 million members of the Communist Party, including 22 million women. And I looked up, and I couldn't put it up here because it was just too much, but the largest percentage actually is peasants and workers. 26% of the Communist Party membership are peasants and workers. Kind of makes sense because they're the largest population, but just if you were wondering. And the membership includes the right to vote, read Communist Party documents, and take part in policy discussions. There's a Communist Youth League, which is from 14 to 28, and they, of course, train people to be communist leaders for the future. And then the young pioneers are under 14 years of age, are kids. Hu Jintao, so the next general secretary, he was born in 1942. So basically, he doesn't experience, he's born in at the end of the Civil War, but doesn't really know the Civil War from a personal experience. He had risen from provincial general secretary, which would be like a governor, right, in the United States system, to vice president under Jiang Zemin. He's more conservative than his predecessors and reintroduced some state controls over the economy and social reforms. Hu presided over nearly a decade, though, of consistent economic growth and cemented China as a major economic world power. He sought to create a harmonious socialist society by improving social-economic equality within China. So he felt that China was becoming too unequal, socially, economically, the rich were much richer than the poor. So he develops a new sort of philosophy, political economic philosophy called scientific outlook on development, which is to replace Jiang's 3 represents. Yes, Judy.
Does China still have capital punishment?
Oh, yeah.
So it makes us, China.
She's asking about capital
So
punishment.
the only countries are us. U.S. still has capital
You're right.
punishment. So China, I think Saudi Arabia, places like that.
Yeah, a bunch of smaller
That's about
countries.
4 countries in the world, and we're with them.
Yeah, we're with them, I know. I don't know the exact, but you're right, very few countries have that. Nobody in Europe has it. I'm sure that they don't?
No, I don't think so.
Oh, really?
I don't know.
I don't know either. That's a good question.
Oh, you got to Google it, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm sorry. So scientific outlook on development incorporates scientific socialism, sustainable development, social welfare, a humanistic society, increased democracy, and ultimately the creation of a socialist harmonious society. And the ideology, again, was an attempt to make China more equal for the masses. Xi Jinping. Okay, so we're getting into current. He's born in 1953. He's younger than I am. Okay, really young guy. He's been the general secretary since 2012, and he's the core leader. He's named the core leader in 2016. Only Mao and Deng were named core leaders, were given that title before Xi. When he was a teenager, his father was actually purged. Now, in the Soviet Union under Stalin, when you hear the word purge, that means you were killed, right? In China, it doesn't mean necessarily. You might be killed, but a lot of times you were just sent away or imprisoned. So his father's purged during the Cultural Revolution. The family actually lived in a cave for a while. Yeah, I had read not that long ago that in China there were still something like 50 million people living in caves in China. Now, I think they're probably improved caves, but probably not like cavemen, but still, when you think about that. He subsequently attended a university on a student peasant scholarship and rose through the ranks to be the vice president under Hu in 2007. And then in the 19th Party Congress last year, in 2018, not 1918, voted to end the two-term limit, paving the way for Xi to be leader for life. Okay, so we're going to get into this a little bit more. So this is actually kind of a fear. Okay, so Xi Jinping as General Secretary. Stability, okay? I looked at a number of sources, Kissinger being one, and then I'll talk about another source, an excellent source in a minute. But they both very strongly stated stability was the number one concern for Chinese leaders. And they both said, of course, if you're trying to run a country with 1.4 billion people, you gotta have organization and stability. So Xi has introduced measures to ensure party unity and ensure internal unity. Xi's anti-corruption campaign led to the downfall of prominent Communist Party leaders. Think back to Mao, right, doing the same thing, right? Some of whom were even members of the Politburo, so the 24 highest members in the country, who also just might have been challenges to Xi's political power. He's a Chinese nationalist. Now, that might sound funny, but what that means is he believes in all of China, not just Han China. Okay, Han China is the largest ethnic group within China, but China is actually very multicultural. Remember the 292 distinct languages? So he calls himself a nationalist, in other words, a promoter for all Chinese, not just Han Chinese. He has tightened restrictions on civil liberties, ideological discourse, increasing censorship and mass surveillance. You've all read, I'm sure, about Google and all these different, Facebook and all the concerns and special rules and things they have to follow in China. Includes internet censorship, which he calls internet sovereignty. Xi has continued socialist market economic reforms, or as Deng called, socialism with Chinese characteristics. I mentioned that term earlier. He has a Chinese dream for the Chinese people, which refers to a set of personal and national norms or ethos and ideals to describe the role of the individual in society, but also as a Chinese society as a whole. So it's basically saying, okay, individual, this is how you should act as a Chinese citizen, and this is how the government should act in its relationship with you and running the country. It describes the desire of the growing middle class. Now, this is, again, demographics, right? The middle class is projected to be 500 million people. That's their middle class, which had come out of a tiny, 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 tiny sliver middle class in 1950 to 500 million people. They say that there's more honor students in China than there are students in the United States. Okay, so just huge numbers here. So and this Chinese dream is basically for people to reach the middle class, similar to the American dream, you know, that was projected, that we grew up under, most of us in the 50s. It also includes sustained development to address pollution and food safety. And you've seen the pollution issues in China are just awful, but they are actually taking a lot of steps to improve that. Human rights under Xi. According to the Human Rights Watch, which is an international organization that watches out for human rights, Xi has launched an offensive against human rights, and China is at its worst level since the Tiananmen Square massacre. The Associated Press in 2018 reported that Xi is waging the most severe systematic suppression of Christianity in the country since religious freedom was written into the Chinese Constitution in 1982, which has involved destroying crosses, burning Bibles, shutting churches, and ordering followers to sign papers renouncing their faith. Okay. Now, let me say something here. This isn't necessarily across all of China. Again, I think we'd start off saying China is not as unified or centrally controlled as you might think. The provinces actually have a lot of power in the way they treat the people. The Guardian, which is a British newspaper, and the New York Times reported in 2019 that China is holding 1 million ethnic Uyghurs in internment camps, and many are forced to assimilate into the ethnic Han society. There was actually an article in the Globe today about that as well, and that's been in the American press quite a bit. Judy?
There was a small Jewish community there, I think in Shanghai, people who were running from Europe,
Yes.
and they ended up in Shanghai.
Are they doing okay?
Probably.
Yeah.
It's such a small group that
Yeah,
people
yeah.
were running much.
Okay.
These are what they ran, you know, running from the Germans, running their
Yes, yeah.
and they ended up in Shanghai.
Red ended up in Shanghai, which was a big business district, you know. Okay, the ideology of the Communist Party under Xi, and this is by Elizabeth Economy, who's an expert, and it's from her book down the bottom, The Third Revolution, Xi Jinping and the New Chinese State, which was published last year. What makes Xi's revolution distinctive is the strategy he has pursued, the dramatic centralization of authority under his personal leadership, the intensified penetration of society by the state, the creation of a virtual wall of regulations and restrictions that more tightly control the flow of ideas, culture, and capital into and out of the country, and the significant projection of Chinese power. It represents a reassertion of the state in Chinese political and economic life at home, and a more ambitious and expansive role for China abroad. Okay? Okay, so is this China's century? Camden, Maine, people are familiar with Camden, Maine, certainly, and the Camden Conference. Have you ever gone to the Camden Conference?
No, I haven't.
No, I haven't either, but it's online, and each year they will have a sort of a week-long, it's almost like a TED Talk, but they bring in many, many people. And last, I think it was March, they had it on China, and the overarching essential question, if you will, for the conference was, is this China's century? And so for the next several slides, I've actually borrowed some information, as any good teacher does, from the keynote speaker, actually, I'll speak about in a minute. I've put up there, you can view all the talks, and they're really good, at the CantonConference.org, and the one in China is the 2019 conference. The other major source I used was On China by Henry Kissinger. But let's go on and look. So what will China be like as a great power was the title of the keynote address by Martin Jakes, who's a senior fellow at Cambridge University in England and a China expert. And he says, China became a great power about 10 years ago as a result of the 2008 financial crisis in the West. He said that's when China really became powerful. He said it wasn't so much what China did right at that time, it's what the West did, okay, with the financial crisis. He said under Xi, China has become a new leader in globalization, and the danger for the West is that it doesn't understand China. The US and Western Europe's worldview is that our way is, and the really important word here is universal, meaning our way of capitalist democracy is the way everybody should be in our view. And it says that the US and Western Europe believe that one day everyone will be like us, okay? And he said that's not a sustainable worldview. China is not like us, has never been like us, or will it be like us? Okay, he says it's really different. And Kissinger says the exact same thing, by the way. China did not refer to itself as a nation state until the end of the 19th century, but in reality is a civilization state. So a country built around civilization, around its culture, as opposed to around politics or government. And it's based on culture and Confucian values. He says China is decentralized, not because it wants to be, but because it has to be. It's one state, many systems. In Western nations, there's typically one state, one system. So we are multi-party, which is the next line here, of course. In the West, the countries have many parties. We have two major parties, of course. But in Europe, there are usually, or almost always, many more political parties that compete against each other. But China, he says, actually has widespread support of its people. Now, you have to kind of forget Hong Kong for a minute, because that's obviously, they're afraid of being pulled in to that system. He says the idea of government in China is drawn from the Confucian idea of family. Okay? So, meritocracy has had a long tradition in China since at least the Tang Dynasty. Meritocracy is you get a job in government based on what you can do, not on what you, who you know or what family you come from. China's role in the world. Okay, Western Europe's traditional role was, he said, essentially an evangelizing mission. In other words, Western Europe went out to change the world by spreading capitalism, government. At first it was kings, you know, the royal governments, but then eventually representative, constitutional, either monarchies or constitutional-based governments like ours, and Christianity. And that was, of course, a powerful motivator for expansion. China, he said, and also the West used its economic power, and he says any great country has to have economic power, which is true. I think we all know that. So he said China's building that economic power, so that's why it's now a powerful country. But he said the West used their economic power to promote political power through military strength. Okay? Now, colonialism is a perfect example of that. And if you think about early colonialism, what came out of early colonialism? The colonies, British colonies and eventually the United States. We're a product of early colonialism. He says China, though, doesn't attempt to change the outside world of its, outside of its world sphere because it's viewed as the Middle Kingdom. And if you remember, in October, we talked about China's view as the Middle Kingdom, and it was a tributary state, meaning other states gave, in China's sphere of influence, which is basically East Asia into Southeast Asia, was the countries would come and give tribute. They gave some money, but basically what they were doing is recognizing the Chinese emperor as the ultimate sort of leader, god, if you will, in a way, and the Chinese culture as the most important culture. This is from their point of view. So they said, we're the Middle Kingdom, meaning we are in the middle of the world. And everybody else, what were people outside their sphere called?
Contributors.
Well, they were contributors, yeah, that's true. Barbarians, okay? And even when we started trading with China back in the 19th century, and England started trading with China, the United States, and Germany and France, China said, well, it's a tributary system. So they're bringing us stuff, and because we're the Middle Kingdom and because we don't really want their junk, you know. They said, what do we need that stuff for? Well, we'll give them some things like, you know, things that they want, like porcelain and silk and things like that in return. And of course, that's what led to the Opium Wars, which lead to the downfall of the Qing dynasty. But the Middle Kingdom is an important goal, and China still sees itself as the Middle Kingdom. Now, this is an interesting one. Between the 14th and 19th century, China had only fought one war outside of its border. That was against Vietnam. Okay? France and Britain alone had fought 142 wars in that same time period. Think about that. Okay. Elements of China's global power. China's economic power will outdistance the West based on demographics alone. This is according to Martin Jakes. He's saying there's no way that the West is going to keep up economically with China. China's population is greater than that of the United States, Europe, and Russia combined. 7 elements of China's global power. One is the economic power and the growth of its GDP. 1980, it was 1% of the world's GDP. And it's projected by, essentially today it's 17 or 18%. And by 2030, it's projected as 34% of the world's GDP. And he said that's totally unprecedented. He said at the height of the British Empire, and at the end of the 19th century, Britain had about 25% of the world's GDP. And that's where, you know, the sun never sets on the British Empire, huge empire. China's strategic relationship with the developing world. China was a developing country, very poor in 1978. It has an affinity especially with Africa, and is building infrastructure in Africa to be able to access Africa's natural resources. China, for such a large country, actually is kind of starved for natural resources. So it's trading, though. It's not going into Africa and setting up colonies or sending armies in. It's actually buying the stuff, trading. The U.S. isn't all that involved. It's somewhat involved in Africa, but nothing like China is. 65% of Africans have a favorable attitude towards China. Now, the Belt and Road Initiative. The Belt and Road Initiative is a 50-year initiative to build infrastructure across Eurasia to transform and link 71 nations, which make up 65% of the world's population, together. So it's sort of roads and terminals, you know, railroads, airports, ocean ports. New regional organizations are developing, and China's currency is increasing in importance. The United States isn't involved in the Belt and Road. There's a map of the Belt and Road. So you can see the blue, think of it as the old Silk Road. The blue is across land routes, and the pink is ocean routes, maritime routes. But it's combining that whole part of the world into this great global, international trading routes. Elements of China's globalization continued. China's military is not Russia, according to Jakes, or the United States in terms of military expenditure and aggression. China, their military represents 1.9% of their GDP, or $250 billion. The United States is 3.29%, or $678 billion before it goes up, which is projected to go up quite a bit next year. This is a percentage of our GDP. And Russia is 5.4%, or $6.1 billion, which shows you how much smaller the Russian economy is. China is unique in that it does not meddle in the politics of other nations. I had to stop and think about that when I heard it and I read it. Politically, it doesn't. Of course, economically, it very much does. And you hear all about, we're going to talk about this in a minute, you know, corporate espionage and all those types of things. The relationship between China and the United States has changed. The U.S. has shifted its position, which was basically, oh, China's a developing nation, and it looks like, and they've been saying this since the 19th century, we can make a lot of money in China. You know, if we can just break into that market, we're going to make a lot of money. To, oh my heavens, they're a huge competitor of ours, and are we going to be able to keep up, basically? So he makes the point, U.S. cannot stop the rise of China. He said, short of, you know, nuclear Armageddon, you're not going to stop China from developing. The problem of the competitive relationship between the United States and China is not about trade, it's about innovation. Okay, Jake said that, and a couple of the other speakers talked about that at the Camden conference. Kissinger really stressed this. He said, China used to just copy what we were doing in the West. In the 1980s, I was working for Henry Close, who was a famous engineering guy, guru, KLH, but Close Video was the projection television sets, okay? And it was in Cambridge in Central Square. It's called Close Video. I ran the last CRT cathode ray tube factory in the United States, okay? So I was running this, and I was the manager, the manufacturing manager for the tubes. And my boss brought in this guy, and Dr. Low from China. And he says, he's a educated PhD engineer. He's gonna help you. You know, he's here to basically be like a consultant. The guy never once made a suggestion. He asked about 400 questions a day, okay, as we went around this factory. And it was pretty proprietary, the way we were making these cathode ray tubes, even though it was kind of at the end of the cathode ray tube technology. So we're expanding, we start selling to India and China. We made television sets that were 5 feet to 20 feet. Now these are projections, so it's basically what this is, right? And so we're running, I had to expand to 3 shifts a day, we're going like crazy, and they call a big meeting. And they said, China has come to us, and they want to buy the company. But don't worry. Henry Close said, no, I'll never sell the company, so you don't have to worry. So I walked out of the meeting, went to my boss, and said, I'm going to give you a 2-week notice. And he said, why? He said, we're doing great. And I said, my Italian immigrant grandfather said, if a company buys more than 10% of your production, they own you. I said, China buys like 80% of our production. Within a month, out of business. The company went out of business. They just pulled the plug on the orders. You know, the company had invested a lot to gear up. Gone. They bought the factory, okay, after it went bankrupt. I was contacted and they said, would you like to go to China to help get the factory up and running? My father-in-law was a mechanical engineering professor at MIT. He said, don't do it, they'll never let you go. He said, you'll have to get it running perfectly before they let you go home. And he says, I've seen that factory, it's never going to run perfectly. So I didn't do it. But anyways, what the point I'm trying to make is they're no longer just stealing ideas. They're, according to Jakes, using incremental innovation. So they may not come up with the original concept of something, but then they really improve on it and put a lot of money into this improvement. It's a mistake for the U.S. to implement protectionist policies, according to Jake, which is exactly what we're doing today, right? And the U.S. must find a way to compete with China instead. Just one more point. The key question for the U.S. China relations, how will the U.S. deal with China when the U.S. is not number one? Okay, we are still number one, but we're probably not going to be, certainly within our lifetime. So how are we going to compete? Now, China's not without problems. Just a couple more slides. It's still a developing country, even though it's a world power. It's a very unbalanced economy. Again, urban wealth versus rural poverty. It has a huge problem with migrant workers. Now, migrant workers, we're not talking about people, you know, from Mexico or from Brazil coming there. We're talking about rural Chinese going into the cities. One of the huge problems is in China, your access to services is based on where you were born, not where you live. So they can't get into the schools, they can't get into, a lot of times, the hospitals. There's a huge national debt, which you keep on hearing, the United States owes China so much money. Well, the Chinese banks are in trouble because they've lent so much money to us and to the Chinese government itself. There's a two-level banking system. The People's Bank of China is their regulatory bank, like our Fed, and then there are 4 state commercial banks. Okay. Well, we're 5 minutes over my deadline, and I was going to give 15 minutes, but you guys ate so many cookies, what can I say? So, will the 21st century be China's century, was the essential question.
Probably.
Probably, okay. Can you?
Well, I think they're going at a rate that is substantially higher than the United States rate. If that continues for another 5 years, it's going to pass us anyway, I think. And they've got more people. I think the student issue is a big one. You know, we have more engineers than we have people or whatever. Right? You know, it's
Yep.
they've got a tremendous amount of resources that they can plug into building the products of tomorrow and making sure that they can sell them worldwide. They're much more farsighted than we tend to be right now, which is more defensive, I believe.
Okay, all good points. Yes, sir.
The U.S. has to reach out to Europe and Africa, South America and places.
Yeah.
Bring them into the game here on our side.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Jakes makes the point Europe really isn't any better with China or with Africa than we are. A little bit better, but not much better. Good point. Mrs. Taylor.
Yeah, what if they call in our debt? We'll be in super trouble, won't we? I mean, don't we owe them a lot of money or something? I don't know. I'm really dumb about this.
Yeah. Should we ask our banker to answer that
Oh,
one?
yeah, let's do that.
No, John's going, not me. Well, that's a fear, but then I've also read a lot where people say, well, they really can't, because if they bankrupt the United States, then they're going to have huge unemployment, and that will cause such unrest that they would...
Who will they sell to?
Yeah, who will they sell to? Exactly.
Yeah, Walmart goes under, then it's done.
Yeah, or Apple.
Apple.
Yeah, I mean, that stuff is made in China.
But they
And
don't make cars here.
oh, they do. Yeah, the Chinese, my buddy who I remember talked about Korea with me in here. He's an automotive industry guy. China makes more cars than the United States does. Yeah, yeah. They just aren't importing them. There are some funny little cars that aren't really on the open market, but they're huge. They make more trucks, everything. Yeah.
I think you have to think, in the world itself, what other country could compete with China? If you think of big landmass, or maybe think of Australia, it's big, right? But if
There's no people.
there's no power there,
Yeah.
where would you go? The US or Canada?
Or U.S. and Canada combined, or yeah,
South America? That's turmoil.
yeah,
So it is a problem. The Chinese, from what I've seen in Asia, and the way they develop their construction businesses, they're very competitive. And they will drive other companies out of business.
yeah.
There's no question they have the economic power to do that.
Right. Yeah. So they're economically very powerful and economically very aggressive, but they're smart. They're not politically aggressive. So they're not coming and taking a country over. So you end up in a war with them. They go in and say, "Hey, can we do business?" Which is a pretty smart thing. I just had this thought, and people can disagree with me. It's almost as if the United States and Canada and Central and South America combined into one country, which isn't going to happen at all. But that's what China did. That's what Mao actually pulled off. He pulls off, Mongolia and Xinjiang and all these different places, and pulls them together into one huge country with lots of people, which is a resource.
Totally. I was so impressed. I mean, I like this whole talk, but the number of people that were murdered or died as a result of these reforms, I mean, millions and billions of people.
Yeah, if
Does it
you,
rival Stalin's Russia?
yeah. No, Russia was that bad too.
Russia did
Yeah.
the same.
Yeah, Russia did the same
So
thing.
it's like, it must
Yeah.
be 100 million or
Yeah,
something.
yeah. The Spanish Empire kind of did the same thing in Central and South America, and it's not.
That's true.
And the British have done it, and
Yeah. Not so easy.
Question. I thought you had mentioned earlier that China had limited resources. Now, I think in terms of Japan, World War II, and Japan had even more limited resources.
right.
And they were forced to go out and be aggressive. Now, China seems to be doing the same thing, except by more peaceful means. It seems like the biggest fear they might have is that we cut them off from their resources, and therefore it would limit their growth, and maybe make us more competitive, but open the possibility of war.
Yeah, and that's what we did actually to Japan. We cut off their oil supply out of Vietnam, their resources, and then they attacked us. And you're absolutely correct to say Japan, before World War II, needed resources, and that's one of the reasons they were so aggressive. So aggressive.
Could this do you see any way we can limit China's growth just by starving them of resources?
No.
Practical way?
Yeah, I doubt it. Yeah.
What do you feel?
I mean, other people can jump in on that. Can we limit China's growth by starving them of resources is the question. I think at our own peril, and certainly in the political climate today we couldn't. Maybe in the future we could do better cooperation, as Jacques is saying. We have to learn to cooperate and compete with them, not just try to stop them by saying, "Oh, we're not going to buy from you," or "We're going to raise the tariffs." There's a big imbalance in import-export, but that's not really as big of an issue as it's made out to be. Yes, sir.
How do you think China has done in terms of innovation?
Well, from what I read, pretty well. Was it 5G? They're supposedly way ahead on. What do you call it? Thank you. That's what. Yeah, he's a mind reader. Yeah, AI. But that's AI. They're way ahead of us on. and artificial intelligence for computers by putting a lot of money into it. They really invest in R&D. They invest not only in universities, we pretty much invest in universities, but they subsidize many companies or enterprises, or they steal some of the information and then incremental development. Yeah. Yes, Ms.
Well, just to note that, you know, in the current election cycle, there's only one person that even has a Chinese name, and he's not really in the running. I mean, my God, it could be soon.
Yeah.
That we have many more. Maybe I'll speak to learn Spanish and Chinese.
It's probably not a bad idea to learn how to speak Chinese for young people for their future.
Also teaching Mandarin now.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah, no, they are. You're right. Andrew Yang, who you mentioned, he talks about all this stuff all the time. Yeah, he's very much on top of it. He wears a thing that says math, but then he's very much. Andrew Yang is a Democrat running for president. Yeah, not a billionaire, but he's a smart guy. Yeah. Well, I want to thank you all for coming. Before you get up, we are going to do a February talk, Genghis Khan and the Mongol Empire. You talk about expansionism. Oh my God. If you don't know about Genghis Khan and the Mongol Empire, that's pretty amazing. Pretty amazing stuff. I want to thank you for coming, and I wish you all a very, very happy holidays and safe holidays, and enjoy your families. And you do me great honor for coming every time I do one of these talks. And